Security guard throws Keanu Reeves out of a children's ward, then realizes he's the anonymous donor. Dressed casually and blending in with visitors, Keanu Reeves was mistaken for an intruder and thrown out. But when staff learned he was the donor funding their children's ward, everything changed. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, a place where the scent of antiseptic mingled with the sweet aroma of flowers brought by hopeful visitors. The children's ward was alive with its usual rhythm, nurses bustling with charts, soft beeps from monitors, and faint giggles drifting from the playroom. This was a sanctuary for healing, where resilience and compassion thrived. Richard, the hospital's newest security guard, was on high alert as he patrolled the brightly lit hallways. A former corrections officer, Richard took his duties seriously. The head of security had been explicit during his training. No exceptions, no excuses. Only authorized visitors were allowed in the children's ward, a sacred space for the young patients and their families. Anything that seemed out of place warranted immediate action. That's why Richard's sharp eyes locked on a man lingering near the playroom door. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt, jeans, and a well-worn baseball cap pulled low over his face, the man blended in easily with the mix of visitors. Yet something about him made Richard pause. Unlike the other parents and family members, who exchanged warm smiles and greetings as they moved through the hall, this man seemed almost too quiet. His movements were calm but deliberate, and he appeared to be trying to avoid drawing attention. Richard narrowed his eyes, his instincts kicking in. This guy isn't wearing a visitor badge. That alone was enough to raise a red flag. He stepped closer, noting how the man briefly spoke with a nurse and gestured toward the playroom. The nurse nodded, but then moved away hurriedly, her face neutral. Richard frowned. The man turned away from the playroom door and began to stroll further down the hall, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. It was a small act, but to Richard, it screamed of someone who didn't belong. He squared his shoulders and approached with purpose. "Excuse me, sir," Richard called out, his voice steady and authoritative. The man turned, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his cap. Up close, Richard noted his rugged features, kind eyes, slightly unshaven stubble, and a quiet air of humility. But Richard wasn't swayed. He had seen plenty of people who looked harmless, but turned out to be anything but. "Yes?" the man said, his tone polite but guarded. "Can I see your visitor badge, please?" Richard asked, his stance firm. The man hesitated, his lips curving into a small, almost apologetic smile. "I don't have one," he admitted. Richard's jaw tightened. "Then I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave. This area is restricted to authorized visitors only." The man raised his hand slightly, a peaceful gesture. "I understand," he said, his voice calm. "I was just hoping to stop by the playroom for a little while." "Without authorization?" Richard's tone grew firmer. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's not how it works. If you're not here as a registered visitor, you'll need to leave immediately." The man sighed softly, glancing toward the playroom door as if torn. He seemed to consider explaining himself, but ultimately said nothing. Instead, he nodded. "I don't want to cause any trouble," he said quietly. "I'll go." Richard stepped aside, gesturing toward the elevator. "This way." The man complied without protest, walking ahead as Richard followed. Nurses and staff turned their heads as they passed, a few of them exchanging puzzled glances. Richard ignored the murmurs, keeping his focus on escorting the man off the premises. When they reached the main lobby, the man paused, turning to Richard with a faint smile. "Thank you for doing your job," he said sincerely. "The kids here are lucky to have someone watching over them." Richard blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. Before he could respond, the man adjusted his cap and stepped out into the bright morning light. The automatic doors slid shut behind him, leaving Richard standing in the lobby, a faint twinge of unease creeping into his chest. Back in the ward, Richard resumed his patrol, dismissing the incident as just another part of the job. Yet as the hours passed, snippets of hushed conversations among the staff began to reach his ears. Nurses whispered in corners, their voices tinged with urgency and disbelief. "Did you see what happened earlier?" one nurse asked another near the break room. "I can't believe it. How could they not recognize him?" Richard slowed his pace. His curiosity piqued. Recognize who, he thought, but he didn't stop to ask. Probably some minor celebrity visiting a patient, he reasoned. Whatever the buzz was about, it wasn't his concern. His priority was to maintain security. But the murmurs didn't fade. They only grew louder as the day went on, seeping into every corner of the hospital. Keanu Reeves lingered outside the hospital, his hands tucked into his pockets as he watched the sliding doors open and close for other visitors. The brisk morning air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. A flicker of disappointment lingered in his chest, though he knew better than to hold a grudge. The guard had only been doing his job. In fact, that was what made it sting less. There had been no malice, only diligence. Still, it hurt to leave the children's ward without spending time with the kids. Keanu had come here unannounced, just as he always did. It was better this way, quiet, under the radar. The joy of seeing a child's face light up at a simple interaction, the gratitude of parents who needed a little hope on hard days, those were the moments that mattered. He didn't need a camera crew or a press release to validate them. But for the first time in years, he felt like a stranger in a place where he had poured his heart. He sighed, adjusting his baseball cap as a memory bubbled to the surface. It had been 5 years since his first visit to St. Mary's, but he remembered it vividly. He had come in response to a letter, a heartfelt plea from a nurse named Claire. She had written to him not for money, but for something far more personal, his time. Mr. Reeves, the letter had read in Claire's neat cursive handwriting, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I'm writing on behalf of the children in our care. These kids face battles most adults can't fathom, and yet they smile through it all. We're not asking for a donation. We're asking if you could stop by and visit, even just once. You don't know how much it would mean to them. Keanu had almost dismissed it at first. It wasn't that he didn't care, far from it, but the thought of walking into a hospital filled with sick children, some of whom might never leave, felt overwhelming. What could he possibly offer them beyond fleeting distraction? Still, something about Claire's words had stuck with him. So, one unassuming afternoon, he'd shown up. There had been no press, no fanfare, just him walking into the children's ward with a shy smile and a few stories to tell. What he hadn't expected was how much the kids would give him in return. Their resilience, their humor, their sheer determination to find joy in the smallest things, it had left him humbled. After that, he'd become a quiet fixture at St. Mary's, stopping by whenever he was in town and supporting the hospital anonymously. The renovations to the ward, the state-of-the-art therapy equipment, even the playroom with its whimsical murals, all of it had been his way of giving back without drawing attention. Keanu rubbed his hands together, the memory warming him even as the chill wind picked up. Maybe this was a sign, he thought. He'd been keeping his visits under wraps for years, but now it seemed his anonymity had created unintended barriers. The hospital staff had always respected his need for privacy, but it was clear the new guard hadn't been briefed. Perhaps it was time to rethink his approach. Before leaving, Keanu decided to take one last look at the hospital. He turned toward the glass doors, his reflection staring back at him. A man trying to make a difference in a way that felt meaningful. The bustling lobby beyond was filled with people, but his focus landed on a young girl being wheeled toward the elevator by a nurse. The girl's bald head was covered by a bright pink scarf, and she clutched a stuffed bunny to her chest. The sight of her reminded him why he kept coming back. It's not about me, he thought. It's about them. Keanu exhaled deeply and turned away, walking toward the parking lot. Maybe next time, he told himself. But even as he left, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this visit wasn't over yet. Richard paced the hospital's break room, his coffee growing cold on the table. The chatter from the nurses had been gnawing at him since morning. Every time he caught a snippet, I can't believe it, or how could we let this happen? It felt like a needle to his gut. He had half a mind to ignore it, but something about the way Claire, the head nurse, had stared at him when they crossed paths earlier made him stop. The break room door swung open and Claire stepped in, holding a clipboard tight against her chest. Her silver hair was pulled into its usual no-nonsense bun, but her face was flushed. Richard, she said curtly, we need to talk. Richard set his coffee down, his shoulders instinctively stiffening. What's this about? Claire closed the door behind her, leaning against it with a heavy sigh. Do you know who you kicked out yesterday? The question landed like a slap. What? Richard asked, his brow furrowing. What are you talking about? He wasn't wearing a badge. He didn't have clearance. Keanu Reeves, Claire said sharply, cutting him off. The man you escorted out was Keanu Reeves. He's the anonymous donor who's been supporting this ward for years. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Keanu Reeves? The name echoed in his mind, almost absurd in its weight. Wait, the actor? He managed to stammer. Yes, Claire said, her tone unforgiving. And he's not just some celebrity throwing money around. He's been here before, visiting the kids, talking to families, making real connections. Half the playroom exists because of his generosity, and yesterday you threw him out like he was some kind of vagrant. Richard felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He replayed the moment in his mind, the quiet man, his calm demeanor, the way he hadn't resisted at all. Suddenly, his reaction didn't seem like vigilance. It felt like ignorance. Why didn't anyone tell me? He asked, his voice defensive now. How was I supposed to know who he was? Claire sighed, her frustration evident. That's the thing about Keanu. He doesn't come here with an entourage or announce himself. He just shows up. No cameras, no fuss. And the staff knows better than to treat him like a celebrity. We treat him like family. Her voice softened, but only slightly. You didn't know, Richard. I get that. But you should have trusted your instincts. Did he seem like a threat to you? Richard hesitated. No, he admitted. But he wasn't following protocol. What was I supposed to do? Just let him wander in without clearance? Claire tilted her head, her gaze piercing. Sometimes the rules aren't enough. Sometimes you have to read between the lines. By the end of his shift, Richard couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his chest. The more he thought about it, the worse it got. The man Keanu Reeves had been gracious, even as Richard forced him to leave. Thank you for doing your job, he had said. At the time, Richard had thought it was a strange thing to say. Now it felt almost like a quiet rebuke. Before heading home, Richard wandered back to the playroom. The walls were lined with crayon-drawn artwork, each piece brimming with life. He noticed a plaque mounted near the door, one he hadn't paid much attention to before. It read, "This playroom is dedicated to the children of St. Mary's, whose courage inspires us all, with gratitude to our anonymous donor, who reminds us that kindness is its own reward." Richard stared at the words for a long time. He had thought he was doing the right thing, protecting the hospital and the children, but now he couldn't help but wonder if he had done the opposite. The next morning, Richard arrived at St. Mary's earlier than usual, unable to sleep after the revelation. He had spent the night replaying the moment he escorted Keanu Reeves out of the building, every detail now tinged with regret. His mind returned again and again to the man's quiet words. Thank you for doing your job. Was it gratitude or something deeper, laced with the disappointment Richard now felt so keenly? He passed through the ward slowly, taking in the sights and sounds with new eyes. The kids laughed in the playroom, their joy undiminished, while nurses moved efficiently from room to room. It was a reminder of the sanctuary this hospital was meant to be, and a painful contrast to the moment he had unwittingly turned away the man who helped make it all possible. Richard paused at the nurse's station, where Claire was scribbling notes into a chart. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Morning," she said, her tone brisk. "Morning," Richard replied, his voice subdued. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Claire set down her pen, folding her arms. "I hope it's to tell me you figured out how to fix this mess." "That's what I wanted to ask you about," Richard admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "I need to make this right. Do you know how I can reach him?" Claire's sharp gaze softened slightly. "You're not the first to ask. After yesterday, the staff's been buzzing about how to contact him. But you know Keanu. He's private. He doesn't leave numbers or fan mail addresses. He just shows up when he wants to." Richard frowned. "So there's no way to reach him?" Claire shook her head. "Not directly, but if he's been visiting this long, there's a good chance he'll come back. The question is, what will you do if he does?" By lunchtime, Richard's unease had settled into resolve. If there was even a chance Keanu might return, he needed to be ready. He spent the rest of the day reviewing procedures and briefing the staff, ensuring they were prepared to welcome visitors like Keanu without hesitation. Then as his shift wound down, Richard found himself wandering back to the playroom. He lingered near the door, watching as a young girl with a bright pink scarf tied over her bald head handed a crayon drawing to a nurse. The nurse crouched to admire the child's work, her face lighting up with exaggerated delight, and the girl giggled. Richard couldn't help but smile. It was moments like these that made the long hours worth it. Suddenly, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. At the far end of the hall, near the elevator, stood a familiar figure. A man in a black t-shirt and baseball cap, leaning casually against the wall as if debating whether to step forward or turn back. Keanu Reeves. For a moment, Richard froze. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he started walking toward the man, his steps purposeful but unhurried. As he approached, Keanu looked up, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Mr. Reeves," Richard began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "I owe you an apology." Keanu raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. "You don't owe me anything," he said calmly. "I do," Richard insisted, his tone firm. "The other day, I made a mistake. I didn't recognize you, and I treated you like you didn't belong here. For that, I'm sorry." Keanu studied him for a moment, his brown eyes warm but inscrutable. "You were just doing your job," he said finally. "I respect that." "Maybe," Richard said, his voice softening. "But doing my job doesn't excuse me from being human. I should have trusted my instincts. You weren't a threat, I could see that. I just didn't stop to think beyond the rules." Keanu's lips quirked into a small smile. "It's not easy, is it? Balancing rules with compassion?" Richard shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "It's not. But I want you to know that I've learned from this. The next time you come here, if you're willing to come back, we'll make sure you feel welcome." Keanu nodded slowly, his smile widening. "Thanks. I appreciate that." He glanced toward the playroom, where the children's laughter filtered through the partially open door. "Mind if I stop by for a bit?" Richard stepped aside, a sense of relief washing over him. "Of course. Go ahead." As Keanu made his way to the playroom, Richard watched, his chest tight with a mix of emotions. He had been given a second chance, and this time, he wasn't going to waste it. Keanu Reeves stepped into the playroom, the sound of laughter and animated chatter enveloping him like a warm embrace. A little boy in Spider-Man pajamas noticed him first, his eyes widening with excitement. "Are you here to play?" the boy asked, holding up a pair of toy cars. Keanu crouched down to the child's level, a smile spreading across his face. "Absolutely. Which one's mine?" The boy handed him a bright red car, and within moments they were on the floor, racing the toys back and forth. Other children quickly gathered around, their giggles filling the air as Keanu gave each of them his full attention. He was no longer a Hollywood star. He was simply a friend who had come to brighten their day. From the doorway, Richard watched the scene unfold. He noticed how naturally Keanu connected with the kids, how he listened to their stories with genuine interest and encouraged their imaginations. It was a rare thing, Richard realized, to see someone so selfless in their kindness. As the sun began to set, Keanu stood near the playroom window, his hands resting on the sill as he gazed out at the hospital's courtyard. Behind him, the children were still buzzing with energy, showing off their drawings and playing games. Claire approached, carrying a cup of tea, and offered it to him with a smile. "You've done so much for this place," she said. "I hope you know how much it means to all of us." Keanu looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "This place does more for me than I could ever do for it," he replied. "These kids remind me what it means to keep going, even when things feel impossible." Claire placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You give them hope. That's more than enough." Later, as Keanu walked out into the evening, Richard felt something he hadn't in a long time. A sense of pride, not just in his work, but in his ability to learn and grow. His mistake had become an opportunity, not just to make things right with Keanu, but to reflect on the balance between rules and humanity. It was a lesson he would carry with him every day on the job. Sometimes kindness needed no badge or clearance, only an open heart.